difficult campaign. So today, I know I'm talking to people that have a scientific background, and so I am a field researcher and I'm a social science. So I come from another perspective. So I am inviting you to be iconoclast, because what we're going to do is try to deconstruct the idea of conservation. Conservation, as all the things that human beings created, it's just an approach, it's a model. And the model I'm going to talk to you about is what we call fortress conservation. It's based in the idea that to save nature, we need to create protected areas, to create spaces where no human activity is allowed. I use the word myth because a myth, in the definition of Ronald Barthes, is a system of communication. It's a way that we express, that we communicate something. And conservation has identified itself as one of the most important myths of the Western culture. And I'm going to talk to you about something that is systemic, as all the myths. That means that it's not an isolated case. It's not just one wrong conservation. It's not just about one wrong national park. It's about an ideology. The most important actually function of myth is to naturalize what is actually not natural. And that is what conservation does. It makes us think that what we are talking about is science, that what we are talking about is natural, but it's not. And there is an ideology behind. And I'm going to talk to you about, we call conservation industry. So it is an industry, and not only because in the countries where it functions, like in a lot of countries in Africa, it is a main economical sector. But we are talking about industry because industry means people and activities involved in producing a particular thing. And conservation produces a particular thing. This thing is a dream. Conservation gives us a dream. This dream is based in, going the other side, in the idea of wilderness. The idea of wilderness is actually an invention. A perfect invention born with Yosemite in the United States in the 19th century. The idea that there are empty space that without human beings is one of the greatest inventions actually of the Western society. But we have to know that the world's most famous natural environments like Yellowstone, Amazon, Serengeti were the ancestral lands of millions of tribal people who have been shaped them, and they have been dependent on them. They nurture and they protect them. This idea of nature as something that was pure, was separate from human beings, is typically from actually Protestantism, Christian, and behind the conservation movement in the United States, there is a very powerful religious root. As you might know, John Muir was a Christian. He came from a Christian family, and all the other very important people of the conservation movement have this important Protestant root. And it's not a coincidence. The other idea that is very, very powerful and is the base of conservation, so on one hand we have wilderness, on the other side we have racism. Why racist? Because the idea is that we know better, that we, Western societies, know how to protect this environment. And it's quite curious because when it's this kind of model deny the important role that indigenous people have had. As I was saying, it's not only that they live there, they have shaped this environment. They have shaped it to improve biodiversity in ways that we don't understand. And when it's about conservation, I just put an example here how racist this movement can be, because on one side, when tribal people hunt to feed their family, they are poachers. And it's very curious that this is a CNN hero, Lila Hassa, who was, so CNN gave her this prize because she was transforming lion killers into lion guardians. The Maasai have lived with lions for generations, but she came there to teach them how to save lions. This is quite interesting. On the other side, the guy you see there is one of the trustees of WWF. And he was a hunter. He is a hunter, not a poacher, because he's white. And this is a very powerful idea behind the conservation movement. We know better. We know how to protect the nature. They are destroying the nature. Another powerful idea behind this dream of conservation is these charismatic big mammals that we are going to save. Because the idea of heroes is very important. We have, in this conservation narrative, is like a good movie. We have everything. We have someone to save, we have heroes, and the heroes are always or white or paid by white organizations. But as a field researcher, why I'm talking about meat and why I'm talking about the dream? Because the people that work on the ground know that actually behind conservation is not a dream, but it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare for the people living in those countries where we decide to go and we decide to stay. Conservation is based in a colonial approach. We know better. And actually, it's based in the idea that we need to militarize those countries in order to protect the nature. I'm going to explain better this in a moment. Most conservation organizations, WWF, WCS, use what we call a sleeping with the enemy strategy. They think we can't change the world, we can't change capitalism, so let's partner with these big organizations and help them to become better, which never happened. And so they partnered with big conservation organizations, big logging companies. Rouget is a French company, and with what other brands that are considered the most polluted companies in the world. But all of this is fine, except collaborating with tribal communities, as I'm going to show you. So, in the name of conservation, we have what we call the human cost of this model of conservation, which are illegal evictions and land theft, extrajudicial killings, I'm going to explain better, and torture and illegal detention. So let's talk about what illegal eviction means. As I told you, this place that we consider wild, that these beautiful forests are not empty. There is people living there. And when a protected area, a conservation organization decide to lobby to create a protected area, usually this means that eco-guards arrive, park rangers arrive. They tell to people, you can't hunt, you can't fish, you can't collect leaves, you can't collect anything. You have to stay away from this protected area. Some people, like in India, live inside tiger reserves, and in African countries can be different because hunter-gatherers would not live inside the forest. They will go to the forest every now and then. But in any case, it's an eviction because then they can't go anymore. But in India, where people is inside with houses inside, the eviction can be terrible, violent. I will show you how an eviction, it is an eviction that took place in Kaziranga, North India.
প্ৰশাসন সোমাই দিলে আপোনাৰ 1800 সোমাই দিয়াৰ পিছত 600 মানুহে আগভাটা দি পেলাই ৰখাব নোৱাৰি তাৰপিছত তাহাঁতে ডাইৰেক্ট গুলি অৰ্ডাৰ কৰিলে গুলি অৰ্ডাৰ স্পট ডেট দুজন মানুহ জেগাতে যেতিয়া ডেট হৈ গ'ল তাৰপিছত ৰাইজৰ ফালৰ পৰা কি উপায় নাই আৰু মানে অনিমা গুলি খায় স্পট ডেট ক'ত গুলি লাগিছিলে তেওঁ বুকুত লাগিছিল পুলিচৰ ফালৰ পৰা মানুহে কেতিয়াবা ক্ষমা খুজিছে নে এইটো কাৰণে নাই আজিলৈকে একো ক্ষমা খোজা নাই
This is how that was a real eviction taking place in the north of India, Kaziranga near Kaziranga National Park, where WWF work. This is a map. It's quite difficult to understand if you're not used to African geography. But there are we can see the countries that are in what we call the Congo Basin. So Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Cameroon and Gabon. And this is just to show you. So the entire land of the hunter-gatherers living in those areas has been divided between African parks, WCS, WWF, and logging concessions. Logging concessions are the one in red, and then we have also trophy hunting zones. This is what we talk about land theft. This is colonialism. And we have to understand that all these partners, all these actors are part of the same system because they will partner between them. Trophy hunting zones, they will partner with conservation organizations. Logging concessions will partner with conservation organizations in order to actually steal the land of people without asking their consent, because no one goes there asking them their consent. And what we would expect that from a logging concession, we wouldn't expect that from conservation organizations that should be in place to protect nature. We have the same thing in India, where you see the dots, these are tiger reserves. There are 50 tiger reserves in India, and 38 of these tiger reserves, in 38 of these tiger reserves, we have documented abuses, land theft, extrajudicial killings, or other stuff going on in the name of conservation. Recently, conservation organizations asked the court to review the Forest Rights Act, which is a fundamental law in India that recognizes indigenous people's right to their land. And the Supreme Court ordered the eviction of what we think could be 1 million people, which is for us impossible to imagine how the government is going to do that. Other organizations working with communities are challenging this in court, so it's not sure, but this is one of the things that could happen to the people living in tiger reserves in India. As I will just remind you that those people have been living with tigers together for generations. They don't hunt tigers. I have been in mostly of those tiger reserves. It's different from the Baka communities I'm going to show you now. The tribal people in India just don't hunt tigers, while the Baka traditionally hunt elephants. So there is not even that excuse. But they are anyway challenging. In this case, WCS especially support a model of voluntary relocations. And this is a Baka girl from Mesokja. Mesokja is a new protected area that is going to be created in the north of Congo, supported by WWF and paid with the money of Americans, Europeans. The Baka don't want this park. I have been there several times, not only me, but other organizations have been in the area. There is no consent at all, but WWF carry on because they think they have to protect that forest. Again, that forest is the house of the Baka. The Baka has been living there for generations, and it's not a coincidence if the Baka are there where the elephants are. They have put in practice techniques to protect the environment. The idea of ecosystem is a very important idea. In the ecosystem, human beings are part of it. And the Baka have been, for example, they leave wild yam when they go for hunting. They go to collect things. They always leave wild yam for elephants because elephants love wild yam. And the Baka know that. They put in practice techniques that are actually protecting this environment. This is denied by big conservation organizations with an approach that I don't know other word to call it colonialist and racist.
Pele amele commandé que quoi le me be kwa no pondo le gbe kwa ka me be no pondo commandé ma jokoko bo ma ko amele kwa zami ko na denda likolo hunga go amango makina pe pele ango ko waja ma me pe po bitike ma so pa peke matiti angwa peke ke boni ma so ko ni ma tutu na go pele ko uja.
She's Paulette, is actually a Baka from Mesokja, and what she's talking about is the thing that Baka face all the time. I have to go a little bit faster here because otherwise we will not have time. In the name of the conservation, we have extrajudicial killings. I told you about the militarization. This is the solution. They are proposing us to fight against poaching, and this is the reason why we have things like that. The image can be very disturbing, but it's what happened on the field. Sorry. I think I did. The 17 years old, you see that, is Nakulire, son. He has been shot by a WCS-funded park ranger because he wanted to come in his home in his park, actually, Kausi Viega Park, to collect some medicinal plants. And the other image is from Casiranga, where there is a shoot-on-sight policy against poachers, and this, in the name of this shoot-on-sight policy, innocent people have been killed. In the last 20 years, 106 suspected poachers has been killed, and one 77-year-old guy called Akash has been shot and maimed for life. And I met his father and his family, and it's quite, he has been shot by a park ranger, and they actually destroy the life of these people. No compensations has been given, no apologize to the family. And this kind of thing would be completely crazy in our countries if we would be shooting people in the name of conservation. But because this is happening in Africa and Asia, we accept it, and we think, as these guys were commenting in some social media, it's fine when it happened in other people's house. We are talking also about torture and illegal detention. This woman is a woman I met a couple of months ago. His husband, Komanda, has been arrested because accused of being a poacher, even if he clearly didn't have any gun. He was put in jail by EcoGuards funded by WWF, and he was raped in jail, and then he died. These stories, I'm not telling these stories to impress you. I'm telling this story because this is what we see on the ground, and this is why we think that conservation is not working. But there are also environmental costs in this model that actually is not working. We don't think that you can ever make conservation or any project in general if you make enemies of locals. Local people have to be empowered and have to be considered in conservation projects. Not only considered, they have to be, their rights have to be recognized in order to be working. Otherwise, this model is not going to work. People is getting angry, and as colonialists end, this model of conservation will end. But there is, as I was telling, a model, there are ecological costs of this. First of all, usually when a protected area arrives, the tourists arrive, tourist infrastructure arrive. And the crowd of tourists and vehicles can stress the animals. They get used to human proximity, which help poaching. Attaching tracking device and moving animals that conservation used to do is often lethal, and allowing herbivores to grow without predation can endanger other species and eventually actually themselves, because herds grow beyond ecosystem ability to provide enough food, as it happened in Botswana with the elephants. Also, when the land is not indigenous people land anymore, profit-making enterprises arrive, like mining, logging, trophy hunting, and of course, they are all partnering usually with this conservation organization. There is another thing, that evicted from their land and without any livelihood, a lot of indigenous people decide at this point to work with poachers. And the most important thing is that all this is diverting attention from the true, so all this money going to these NGOs that are actually not doing their job is diverting attention to tackle the true cause of poaching, which are corruption, corrupt officials that work, or officers that work with functionaries, and the consumption of wild species. No one is tackling this problem. And these organizations are not actually tackling the main problem, which is our economical system that is destroying the planet. And they just focus on this protected area model that actually, in this protected area model, is not working. But just finish saying that indigenous communities are fighting, and the democratic voice are raising, and there are a lot of local groups in India, especially in Asia, but also we have them in Africa, that are raising their voice. And after BuzzFeed published their articles about WWF, there is a more important attention from political side, not only from media, about this issue. Finally, I would just tell you what can you do. In our point of view, the only way to protect the forest is protect indigenous people's land. There's no another way to do that, and we should empower communities. That is why I invite you to decolonize conservation. Try to think that, as I was saying, it's a model, and as all models can be improved, and as all models is not going to be forever, and we can change it. And do not be complicit as a future conservationist. We invite you to not work in projects that doesn't have the free, prior, and informed consent of people, as you wouldn't do in your own countries. do not visit national parks where evictions have taken place, and speak against this, because no one is speaking against conservation. It's like I was saying, a myth. They are completely the good guys, and we need more voices. And this is something we met with people in the Congress of the United States last week, and they say there is no awareness about it. No one knows what is going on. So please talk and share this information. Elevate the victim voice. That is why I put videos, because I think that the most important thing here, I mean, I'm talking about it, but the people who have been facing these abuses are the ones that we should be listening. And follow us in social media. We share a lot of information there. Thank you very much. I hope it's on time. Yeah. Thank you. I think I can do that. I'm not good. Where is you? Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm not used to this one.
No, this one.
So it's working the other side. That it's like this is going forward and this back.
Which one? Okay.
It's the opposite. Let's be fair.
Thank you very much, Fiore, for that introductory talk. She's mentioned a lot of the things that I was going to touch on, which will make me able to concentrate on other areas. Now, we work within standards or paradigms. Right now, we're dominated by paradigms in the conservation discourse all over the world. And this is what we really need to clean up, because the paradigms are what, the framework within which these injustices occur, particularly in the global south. Paradigms include protected areas. These are they're anachronisms, really. For example, in East Africa, where I come from, it's acknowledged by science to be the cradle of mankind. Yet, in 2019, we think the ideal landscape is that without people. It's an oxymoron, but one that sells very well and people invest heavily in. Overpopulation. Overpopulation is not a simple thing. It's about the footprint of people. Strain on resources is the footprint. It's not the strict amount of people, it's the distribution of people. It's what they do on the land that they have. So we often have people who themselves occupy tens of thousands of acres, talking of lands being overpopulated. Thirdly, there's financial valuation. This is probably the most dangerous, because it consigns nature and ecosystem services to those who have most money to pay for them. And it means it is something that can be purchased and traded, which is a serious problem of principle. Then there's saviors and heroes. I come from Africa, where there's lots of saviors. I'm sure you know all of them, and none of them are black. That's a problem, because it either means that we are working in a completely racially prejudiced field, or that black people know nothing about wildlife and conservation. Indigenous peoples, again, the paradigm is that they are the problem. In Africa, the sort of very coarsely put, the principle of conservation in Africa is African wildlife is in peril and the problem is black people. That's the operating principle with all these big NGOs operating in Africa. And it's drawn from the days of colonialism. Then also there's tourism, which itself is also a very complex thing, because it can edify people, it opens our minds, those of us who have traveled, yet tourism also has the potential to defile societies and places. Quickly talk about the half-earth theory. I'm sure a lot of you have read or heard about this, and the first I heard of it, I sort of laughed, thinking that this is ludicrous, and it may be advancing years or something. But the fact is, it got traction, and it's getting support, and there's even a half-Earth project. And it worries me, because if half the Earth was to be conserved, it wouldn't be New Haven. it would be tropical Africa, where I come from. It wouldn't be London. It wouldn't be Harvard, where these discussions are being had. It would be the place where I come from, and where would we go if it were to happen? So this, thankfully or hopefully, will never happen, but it shows where the thinking, the flaws, fundamental flaws in the thinking around conservation. And obviously, it's got, as I said, it's gotten traction, and even sort of pretty august outlets like National Geographic are now talking about it. Now, I quickly go to the protected area. That's the IUCN definition. IUCN is International Nature Conservation Union. It's dedicated, managed through legal or other effective means, I put the red font, to achieve long-term conservation of nature. And these are the effective means. It's bizarre that these other effective means are obviously outside the legal sphere, yet this definition is the working definition globally now. So it accepts injustice as part of conservation, or it's okay because it's being done for conservation. And we have this sort of twilight zone where these are just two pictures. On the left there, there's a global award for this Marana Boisho Conservancy, is a wildlife conservancy in Kenya, which they were given just this month. And on the right, you have a report that the landowners are rebelling, and that's just last week. So you can see that there's doublespeak going on all over the world, and something that's essentially very faulty is being portrayed all over the world and awarded for being something very positive. Oops, sorry. The new threats, I said, is elitism and racial prejudice, the neoliberal approach that thinks we can trade around people's heritage. Exclusion and militarization, human rights violations that Fiore spoke about. Then there's the annexation of lands and resources. Some of the lands annexed as protected areas somehow happen to have valuable mineral wealth. In some cases, oil, some cases, obviously, logging, some cases, precious metals, etc. And there's also the fracture of societies. When we fragment lands into pieces and call them conservancies or protected areas or whatever we want to call them, we fracture the societies in those places, because in Africa and many parts of the global south, people live on the land. The geographical location where you come from defines you in so many ways, defines your identity, your culture, etc. So we cause these fractures due to this naive approach. Now, the neoliberal approach, what's going on now is something like the Berlin Conference of, I think, 1887, where a group of white men met in Berlin to decide how to divide Africa. Right now, what we have is something called a Coalition for Private Investment in Conservation. And it was started a couple of years ago, and it's basically mobilizing private capital to invest in conservation. So what's the return? Because this is not charity, this is investment, hard-nosed business. What's the return? Again, they meet and decide on who is bringing to the table. And the people who are custodians of the resources they're purporting to invest in are not represented at the table. Granted, there's a few women there now, as they talk about what to do with Africa's resources. If you look at the extreme right of the banner behind them, you will see Yale Center for Business and the Environment. It will be maybe familiar. It's quite a big group, including Conservation Capital, Credit Suisse, Cornell Business, and several other investors. Key amongst these, obviously, is the Nature Conservancy, WWF, and WCS. You can see them there as well. This is an example of the sort of things they do. This is a schematic diagram, rather complex, sorry, that purported to give fair price to pastoralists for their livestock in northern Kenya. But it only gave fair price to those who adhered to the rules they've imposed. After giving the fair price, they deducted some money from that fair price to be put back into conservation projects. And the net effect is that the fair price that was gotten was not enough to restock what these people had sold. So the net effect of this is destocking destocking the land and compromising the livelihood of pastoralists. Why destock the land? In pastoralist communities, livestock is the glue that holds them to their land. If a Maasai man does not have any cattle, you will not find him in Maasai land. There's nothing for him to do there. And likewise with pastoralist communities all over the world. If you take away the livestock, they move away to maybe the nearest town or go work for somebody somewhere else. So that leaves land free for annexation. Seascapes are not immune to this either. The Nature Conservancy here again took over a huge seascape around the annexation is my words, but the rest from Financial Times, a $15 million loan from Nature Conservancy, plus $5 million of grants from various foundations. We used to purchase $20 million worth of Seychelles sovereign debt held by European nations. And they agreed for this to designate 210,000 square kilometers of its ocean as marine protected areas, thereby restricting their use to research and regulated tourism, while prohibiting damaging activities. Well, the fact is the damaging activities can go on, but you have to talk to TNC now. You don't talk to the Seychelles government. As you can imagine, island nations are dependent on fisheries and marine resources for almost everything. So an island nation cannot claim sovereignty when someone else controls the ocean around them. That's just not true. Who ultimately benefits? If you do the math, that comes to about $7.32 rental per square kilometer per year. I mean, I could afford a few square kilometers at that rate for my exclusive use. So this is not, this is very exploitative. And what about the commerce indigenous livelihoods? And a quote from the Financial Times, you know you succeed when all the stakeholders leave a little unhappy. That's from Robert Weary, TNC Director of Conservation Finance. That shows what we are dealing with here. Such injustice has to be defended by violence. It can't fly. You can con people for 1 year, 2 years, but they'll soon wake up and start pushing back, and you have to get violent. And violence is occurring. We are having supposedly civil society organization running armed law enforcement in Kenya. We are having former defense contractors getting into wildlife crime prevention in East Africa. That sort of shows you the kind of money that's in there. When people who are doing black water type operations, anti-piracy and stuff, are now getting into conservation stuff. And obviously, they, or I'd say sadly, they all go around with the American flag everywhere. There's a British group, the Trojan Group, again, just mercenaries. Teaching violence, not law enforcement. So we do have these protests as people are losing their land. This is just from last month, in northern Kenya. And the pushback is beginning to get bigger. And the problem with northern Kenya is that there's a lot of firearms in community hands, and it will get violent. There's been violence in 2017, and it will get worse next time there's a drought. Again, and the Conservancy Rangers this is run by a Nature Conservancy proxy in Kenya, do have extrajudicial killings because they don't carry handcuffs. They're not intending to arrest people. There's another type of violence that largely escapes mention. Then just sharing a poster from an event which happened in June in Washington, D.C. They're proposing family planning as a tool of conservation in Africa. Now, this presents a serious ethical problem. I mean, population, family planning, etc., is important as far as service delivery, human health, etc., is concerned, but it has no place at the biological conservation table. Humans are not elephants or lions or whatever, monkeys. But this is exclusive to Africa. You will never hear anyone talking about the population of China impacting on panda conservation. You will not hear people talking about family planning in India in order to conserve elephants or tigers. This is racism at its maybe most insidious because it's clothed in a lot of technical language that makes it acceptable even to people who generally know better. This is another very quiet violence that's going on. The protagonists are listed down there: TNC, Jane Goodall Institute, WCS, and funded by USAID. The rhino, highly endangered, but in my opinion, the most powerful land grabbing tool we have today. Because whenever you put out rhinos, you get a license to fence a whole area. This is in northern Kenya, 120 square kilometers. You see the solid black line is been fenced as a rhino habitat. This is as with the advice of ecologists, obviously, this area with permanent water, good grass, etc., etc. So to hell with the people who need to graze there or fetch water there. And this is the quiet, unspoken violence that goes on day in, day out, and it's funded by taxpayers' money. It's funded by private donors who give money meaning well. And this is what we and yourselves as academics, as students, have to really look closely at going forward. Because pastoralism is in northern Kenya is really the only livelihood that's socially sustainable. And if you try and curtail it, the climate resilience of these people is completely compromised. So we have them often chased out of their lands, have to go down the roads looking for keep getting harassed, looking for new grazing grounds. Bizarrely, the tourism industry is really in love with their culture and the beadwork and all that. So we want someone to dress like that to serve drinks at a lodge, but we don't want him to dress like that and herd his livestock. The prejudice stares us in the face wherever we go. Yet we do know that livestock and wildlife coexist very well in Kenya and so many other places around the world. This exclusivity mutual exclusivity is completely a human creation. So we find it in terminology. That's why in conservation we have to bring in sociologists, linguists, anthropologists, because we see this sort of thing and it's called habitat encroachment. Then we see that and it's called a riding safari. What's the difference other than one is white people on horses and the other is a black guy with cows? And it's in the similar areas. But this language is what couches all this in what seems acceptable. Such photographs are all over, with sort of admired and seen as triumphs. Yet when one is killed in conflict like that, it's a tragedy. It's still a dead elephant, isn't it? We find people like that called sportsmen, while people like that are called poachers. Having killed a small dick to eat, they are going to probably eat all the parts of it. Yet the sportsmen claim that they provide employment to local people or provide resources to local people. Those of you with keen eyesight would have noticed a black man having been told to crouch behind the buffalo because you don't want to see his face in the photo. That's our position in sport hunting in Africa. You will not see a black man as an intellectual participant in whatever is going on. It's apartheid. It's colonization. Tourism, I really like this quote from Jeremy Seabrook. Mostly, I'd like to say it sanitizes and cleanses, offering people an experience prepackaged in the great factory of illusion, sensations that crafted by an industry which masks real relationships in the world. So we need to be very careful about tourism. It should not be contrived. It should not mask real relationships. It should celebrate the real relationships between people and their environment, etc. Often Kenya is presented in this manner as wilderness. Wilderness doesn't exist in Kenya, and a lot of the tourism brochures you see make good use of Photoshop to remove villages, people, and all this kind of thing. And if you come to Kenya looking for wilderness, I'm sorry, you won't find it, because there's people. There's people, and these lands are used by people. So the splendid isolation is a figment of the myth Fiore spoke about. So we find we find donors who will not invest in giving, in enhancing water sources for domestic use, but will invest in financing water sources in the same place for recreational use. There's a deep injustice in this, but we, the scholars, practitioners in conservation, have sanitized it over the years and made it seem okay. Writers have done it, the media. You have game meat, you have bush meat, you have hunting, you have poaching, you have exploring, you have encroaching, you have ranchers, you have herders, you have travelers, you have nomads, you have people, you have communities. The red are black and the green are white people. And the last one, especially people and communities. community sort of dehumanizes. It gets rid of, it's a term that gets rid of the individual. That an individual who is somehow harmed by this process doesn't matter because the community has accepted, or the community is happy, or someone speaks on behalf of the community and says it's okay. So these are terminologies we have to look at. So we have to get linguists in, we have to get communication people in, we have to get people who study culture as well. So that conservation, we stop kidding ourselves that conservation is biology. It isn't. Ways forward, I'd propose we need to research into local human contexts, emphasis on local. We need to develop context-specific standards and measures of success. It's ridiculous to measure success in conservation by geographical area. Now I've got a park, 100,000 acres park. Next year, I've succeeded in getting another 50,000 acres. That's not a measure of success. So we need to get more sophisticated measures of success. That's a measure of colonization. We need to partner with the humanities, as I said before. We need to separate tourism from conservation. It is a byproduct of conservation, not a goal or measure of success of conservation. Let's support and not supplant existing livelihoods. Let's see how we can make pastoralism sustainable, not do away with it. Let's see how we can make the offtake of some wild species for food sustainable, not do away with it, or maybe even provide other sources. And we need to invest time. None of these things I've talked about can happen quickly. We need to invest time, not just money and violence in conservation. I'd like to acknowledge Survival International, the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, Os Schmitz, Melanie, and all the others who helped put this all together. Thank you very much. Yeah. My email is there for those of you who need to.
Yeah, I think we have 9. Anyone have questions? Oh, there is a microphone. Perfect.
Hi. Thanks for a very interesting talk. You've highlighted some very egregious examples from a very complex area. So I was wondering how the problems with, or your perceptions of the problems with conservation compare to the problems with things like mining and logging, and sort of, are they worse or better than the problems that you've highlighted in conservation? And if there's time, sort of your ideal vision of how conservation would work. Thank you.
Maybe I can. I'd say the problems with conservation stem mostly from the fact that we do not give conservation the scrutiny it deserves. A mining company gets put under the spotlight, and most countries and even companies themselves have rules that they need to do A, B, C, D. Okay, sometimes the rules are not good enough, sometimes they're not followed closely enough, but the frameworks exist. The problem is that conservation operates in a complete sort of regulatory vacuum because we are the good guys, we are saviors, and we are above reproach. So I think conservation, talking about East Africa, I think what would work, obviously we should keep the protected areas we already have. I would not advocate for those being done away with. But we should not be creating any more, because by definition you have to perform an injustice to create a protected area now, unless it's on a desert island. I think conservation should work by maintaining connectivity between habitats. Connectivity to be used by people who walk their livestock or walk themselves to go certain places. Connectivity to be used by the wildlife themselves without having to pass through dense human habitation, etc. Certainly not by fragmentation. I think we should do away with fencing. It's very sad that so many of us with PhDs and high qualifications come up with fencing as a solution, something which was cutting edge maybe back in the Great Wall of China and that. But we must think, we must invest time. Fencing is very simplistic. So I think sophisticated solutions, not one fits all. Yeah.
Hey. Thank you for your talk today. It's really, really good to hear this in this context. and I appreciate you speaking truth to power as a CBA employee and a future employee at one of the major financial institutions you showed. In relation to conservation finance, it is obviously an extremely imperfect and like rather blunt tool. Can you see it working though? Is it just a matter of making sure the stakeholders and local people get paid more, or do you think there are like major changes that need to happen to these financial instruments?
Yeah, I think it can work. But they should invest in people, not in forests, not in animals. These are not things that exist in vacuum. So, for example, if there's a pastoralist society, I can see investment coming into developing a good, fair, and efficient livestock production and marketing system, which would take stock of the land in a sustainable manner, would put money in people's pockets, and theoretically leave a sustainable environment in place. But if you give the money to a conservation organization like Northern Rangelands Trust or the Nature Conservancy, and you just wait for returns from them, what they're going to do with your money to get you your returns will by definition include injustice. So I think there's a broker. You need to cut out this middlemen, or for lack of a better term. So it can work, but what I'm describing takes a lot more time, engagement, etc. It's not about just putting money, and conservation tends to receive lots of blank checks. Yeah.
Hi. So given that you mentioned that some of these mercenaries, wear American flags around, and that the U.S. has, corporate rule on this stuff, and it produces colonialism, and the neoliberalism, militarism, imperialistic approach has not worked, obviously. Yeah. So my question is, unfortunately, the U.S. administrations have undue influence on international politics and even influence on, specific individual countries' domestic policies. So is there a candidate in the 2020 election you think best advocates for anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism and that kind of thing?
Is there any?
Is there a candidate in the 2020 election who advocates best for this kind of something that you think could really help?
I honestly don't know enough about the candidates stand on this particular thing, although I do like Elizabeth Warren. But I think the key thing about U.S. Influence on what goes on in other places is a lot of it is done through sort of technocrats. So maybe individual politicians might not have as much influence on it, but I think the technocrats and the government systems in the U.S. would do well to bring greater scrutiny on the recipients of these funds, and invest maybe more in terms of human and financial resources on oversight, and continuous oversight, not just at the beginning of the proposal. Okay, this guy looks good, give him $10 million for 10 years. Within 5 years, a lot can change. So continuous monitoring, I think is the way to go, and that's why I pointed towards the measures of success, because they give the money. Then after 10 years, this guy reports, we've doubled the land under conservation management, and we celebrate it. But in the process of doing that, he's maybe killed a few families, he's driven a few people into poverty, and subverted all sorts of law. But we are looking at the beginning and the end. We should look at the whole journey, the whole process. Maybe you can add
Yeah, but also public opinion actually is changing things. After the BuzzFeed article, we have seen, so Congress called us to talk about this issue. So it's true that this is something that people that fight for social justice know. No change will come from them. We are the ones who have to push them to change. That is something Martin Luther King said. It's completely true. They're not going to change because they are in the good position. That is their business. It's a machine of money, and it's an ideology behind. So they're not going to change because they realize it's a wrong model. It's us who have to push them to change. And I think that public opinion actually changing the things, because I'm very, very surprised when I started working in this campaign 4 years ago. It was impossible to get an article published in a newspaper about talking about WWF, talking about this issue. And now, really, we have been called by the Congress to talk about this issue, and things start to change. But as I was saying, it's public opinion. Really, we don't realize how much power we have, but we do. If all of us raise our voice, we can change things. I think it's time, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Thank
you
you
very
all.
much. Use your computer.
Yeah. Hello. Pleasure to meet you. Welcome.
Things that I found really interesting in the next slide, there's examples of like faith organizations
Yeah.
like NRT are doing. And I think they would say that they share those goals. Like you're talking about making arrangements profitable. So do you think the issue is that they don't share the right goals, or that something just got lost in between?
You know,